Hi, everybody. It's week 3, and this week tags on to last week, where, last week I said, what is policy? And it seems like a simple question. It's not. This week, the question is, what is policy analysis? And you note I gave you some readings to look at in our attempt to answer this question, and I will go through these as we move along. Okay, so I gave you this book by Radin called Beyond Machiavelli, and I like her book. Well, I like the title, for one thing. If you've read Machiavelli, The Prince, um, this kind of Italian Renaissance story of this advisor to royals, really. And we think of Machiavelli as sort of this cynical person who is basically interested in power by any means and holding on to power. But the other aspect of Machiavelli is an advisor, in a sense, a policy advisor to those in authority. And in a sense, that's really what policy analysis is about. In a pure sense, is that policy advisors really, policy analysts, I should say, provide advice to policymakers, that being constitutionally authorized people who can make policy. And when I say that, I'm careful to say that because, we think of lawmakers, really people elected to Congress or the state legislature or the city council or the school board. Those are the people who are constitutionally designated as policymakers. But we also know, don't we, that there are other policymakers in our democratic system and in the systems of many nations. And sometimes that comes under criticism, doesn't it? We think of people who work for agencies as designing policy. We know that our policy at the national level is based on law that Congress passes, and it's also based on what we call rules, which are created by agencies. So think again of the example I used last week, the Clean Power Plan, which really is a rule or a set of rules from the EPA during the Obama administration, and now the Trump administration is going about trying to turn away or turn over the Clean Power Plan, right? But the Clean Power Plan was never a law; it was a rule. And so sometimes we do get, I think, justifiably confused because the line between rule and law is sometimes rather blurry, isn't it? So what Radin's talking about really, and this is why I like her book, is she's talking about how policy analysis really came to be in the United States. And it's really an outgrowth of World War II, as so many things in our modern American history are. World War II is this enormous historical watershed for so many things, but policy analysis really comes from that. And this reference to Harold Laswell in 1951, what Laswell is talking about, Laswell himself innovated the use of content analysis really as a methodology. And he and his cohorts innovated it during World War II, really to analyze Nazi propaganda, to understand how Goebbels and other propagandists in the Nazi regime were actually effective. But what we also know from World War II is that was really the first, we could call it the first sort of scientific war. It was the first war where the sciences and the social sciences were really brought to bear in the war effort. So economics theory was used in conjunction with strategic bombing. So the whole theory of strategic bombing was really something that was apart from military doctrine. It wasn't just to bomb the enemy, it was to bomb actually the enemy's centers of economic gravity, if you will. So bombing plants that produced various parts that were used in the war machine. So one of the more famous and costly bombing efforts by the Americans was bombing the ball bearing factories in Germany because, of course, you can't operate any kind of machinery, mechanical device without ball bearings. Um, and so that's an example of it. And after World War II, as a matter of fact, the Army Air Forces produced this really uh, voluminous survey, the Strategic Bombing Survey, to argue that they had been successful in shortening the war. But we also saw the use of operations research in military planning. So, for example, the Normandy invasion of 1944 was really heavily colored with operations research and logistics research in order really to make that invasion a success. We saw the use of psychology in the training of military forces. We saw even things like the science of diet. We know that the school lunch program actually was an outgrowth of World War II because of the observation made by military leaders that those men who had been drafted into the military uh, were exceptionally undernourished, many of them. Well, you know, we have to actually couple that with the fact that the United States was coming out of a very deep depression, economic depression, and so malnutrition might be understandable. And also, along with the depression, of course, we had things like the Dust Bowl in the Plains states, and we had some agricultural issues during the 1930s. But be that as it may, what we see is a lot of social science and hard science being put to use during World War II, um, not just the military, in an effort to win this war. And so policy analysis had its outgrowth from that. And again, in the 1960s, what we see is this growth of what was called Planning, Programming, and Budgeting System, PPBS. This was actually a contribution by the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, who was famously the CEO of Ford Motor Company, but he's also famously really a cost benefit analysis and a quantified a quanti what am I trying to say? He's a quantitative expert, and this was his contribution. He thought that he said that the military budget should be based on matching plans and programs together in order to create a budget that actually supported the plans and the programs. Well, that doesn't seem really revolutionary to us now. But that really wasn't the way things had been done. And this PPBS kind of thinking really disseminated itself throughout the federal government. That mentality diffused throughout other agencies in the federal bureaucracy. And that has evolved, right? So now we have seen the growth of program budgeting, not just at the federal level, but at state and local levels, where we consciously try to tie the program and the policies of governments to the budget itself. And so this is very much in line with what Radin is saying, that really this growth of policy analysis really was a post-war phenomena. But at the time, as Radin points out, it was policy analysis was very much seen as a removed and neutral activity, as opposed to a political activity. Even though, the policy analysts at the federal level were supporting the particular agencies and departments of particular presidents, for example, it was still seen as this kind of neutral activity. And the equivalent I would draw now would be to the Congressional Budget Office, which has existed since 1974. And the Congressional Budget Office was created specifically to be nonpartisan, and it still is that way. So the Congress actually takes great pains to ensure that the CBO remains nonpartisan. And so all the policy analysis that you see coming out of CBO is nonpartisan, theoretically. And it really is. But we also now know that we have I'll talk about this in a minute. We have nonpartisan think tanks, for example, RAND, but we also have partisan think tanks like Heritage Center or the Center for American Progress. But all of these had their beginning really during this era. So what is policy analysis according to our text, Kraft and Furlong? This is what they say on page 115, that really it consists of examining components of policymaking processes such as formulation and implementation. So we go back to, if we go back to the simplistic notion that policy is created kind of in this stages model, policy analysis can be applied at many parts, many different stages of the model. It usually involves studying substantive policy issues, like ensuring health care to the population. It usually involves collecting and interpreting information to clarify causes and effects, right? And so this is where we can actually, for example, do regression analysis or other kinds of analyses where we can actually identify the effects and their statistical effects on dependent variables. It does draw from numerous disciplines like economics, political science, psychology, philosophy. I mean, I think I would probably add things like physical sciences like climatology, biology, geology, disciplines from civil engineering. I'm not sure how you could do a policy analysis of, for example, the road infrastructure without disciplines like civil engineering and hydrology and geology. What about our policies regarding climate change? Obviously, climatologists are not policy scientists, but their work has certainly influenced the policy of climate change. And I finally, as Kraft and Furlong mentioned, but I also like to mention, is that I think policy analysis is really part science and part political judgment. Both are important, and even if one believes that science should be more important than political judgment, the reality is political judgment is always there. So I'm going to spend a few slides just emphasizing the steps in the policy analysis process. Of course, you're reading this week, so I don't want to be too redundant, but I really want to emphasize this because this is where we're headed in our project, as I'm going to talk about in a few slides. So Kraft and Furlong say there's 5 steps. I'm going to contrast what Kraft and Furlong say to what Bardak says with the Eightfold Path, if you will. So the 5 steps are: define and analyze the problem, construct policy alternatives, develop evaluative criteria, assess alternatives, and draw conclusions. So the very most important thing in this is problem definition. If you don't know what the real problem is, then it's going to be hard to analyze that problem, right? So we have to recognize the situation as a problem of some type. So there's some unsatisfactory condition that requires relief from somebody, and that somebody could be private means or the government. There has to be a recognition that you can actually describe this unsatisfactory condition in language that people understand. And you recognize that you must start coming up with causes. And so this is a lot more difficult, right? Because it changes the way that you present the policy alternative. So in a few weeks, I'm going to have you read about the CBO report on Social Security. It's a really thorough report. But Social Security, and I use this example because I use it a lot because it's so multifaceted. So people say there's a problem with Social Security. Okay, what is the problem with Social Security? Well, when you actually start talking about it, there are many problems with Social Security that you could state as a problem. You could state that the trust fund from which recipients are paid is actually going to be bankrupt in about 2030. That's a problem, right? But you could completely separate yourself from that problem, and you could state other problems about Social Security. For example, you could say that Social Security overpays people with means and underpays people without means. Well, why is that a problem? Social Security is based on your 35 highest years of income. If the jobs you had for 35 years weren't exceptionally well paying, that really means that your Social Security check when you turn full retirement age, 65 or 67 or whatever it might be for you, is still going to be small compared to a person whose 35 highest years of work were quite high. A person can max out on Social Security, but what research has found is that the people that get the highest checks are probably also the people that need them least. So this is why some people advocate means testing for Social Security. So there are other problems that we could actually identify in Social Security, but you're still writing about Social Security. So you have to be careful to understand the problem that you want to define, because it's going to drive the way your analysis is written. So the second step is construct policy alternatives. So you have to recognize that there's different tools to address the stated problem, right? There are tools like regulation, subsidies, market incentives, taxation, direct spending, public education. Okay, this kind of brings us to a discussion of climate change, for example. So we can regulate the industries that produce carbon emissions, the industries that affect climate change. We can regulate them, tell them you will not do that. Or we can use other tools like carbon trading. We can use public education to educate people on climate change. So not all policy alternatives actually involve direct government, right? Some do, many do, but not all of them actually involve direct government, do they? So I would say smoking policy, for example, has involved both direct government, it has involved regulations, it's involved some market incentives, it's involved education, right? So we have for many years various levels of government gone to great lengths to educate people on the hazards of smoking cigarettes. That has had some effect, but we also know that governments have used taxation as a direct tool to try to limit people from smoking, right? So it costs a lot more now to buy a pack of cigarettes than it did when my dad was smoking the little filterless Camels that the Army gave him as a draftee. He paid very little for that pack of cigarettes. Now he would pay, maybe 5 or 10 times as much. So we've used both of those kinds of alternatives. So that's important. The third is choose the evaluative criteria. So, all right, so a lot of us really want to use quantitative models, and that's great, that's perfect. We should actually be able to identify dependent and independent variables and construct some kind of model that actually helps us isolate variables, right? But there's other means of doing policy analysis. Cost-benefit analysis is one. That is an exercise really in finding ways to monetize benefits and costs, which actually sometimes can become more subjective. There's risk analysis. The insurance industry is built on risk analysis. There are political factors, right? And so we hear this a lot. People argue about constitutional rights. People argue about personal freedoms. People argue about public safety. In a sense, those are very abstract, but in another sense, they're very real. I mean, the Constitution is a real document, and it lays out real rights. And so analyzing things in terms of constitutional rights is something that is feasible for you to do in a policy analysis, or things like damage to the environment. So you have to have an evaluative criteria. The fourth step is assess the alternatives. Now, so here's where all of us get in trouble when we're doing a policy analysis. We have to fairly assess the alternatives. If I have 3 alternatives, I need to use the same criteria to evaluate all of them. I don't need to load in favor of my favorite alternative, and I don't need to use one kind of criterion for one alternative and a different kind for another criterion. The evaluation process actually involves applying the alternative to all of them, or applying the evaluative criteria to all of them fairly. And then finally draw conclusions. Okay, so what's your best approach and what's the recommended solution, right? So you can kind of see, if you've learned about things like the comprehensive rational decision-making model, that's what draw conclusions is. Is it always comprehensive? Is it always rational? Those are really the questions you have to ask yourself when you're drawing your conclusion. And can you actually state the weaknesses of your own approach? That is, are you prepared to withstand the criticism that is going to be applied to your approach? Because criticism is really a fact of life. So there's different types of policy analysis that Kraft and Furlong talk about: scientific, professional, and political. So what's that about, right? I'm actually referring to this in the week's discussion question. I say, have we balkanized policy analysis? You all know what balkanized means. You split everybody and everything up into their little tribes, just like was done in the Balkans. But so have we balkanized policy analysis? We certainly, I would argue, and many people argue, we certainly balkanize media, right? People who watch Fox News don't watch MSNBC and vice versa. You could argue that we've balkanized media, probably to our detriment, really. But have we balkanized policy analysis? I gave you a list, I'll go back to this, of scores of think tanks that in the United States. If you want to talk about a policy area, you can get a policy analysis from Cato, from the Heritage Foundation, from the Center for American Progress, from RAND, from Brookings. You can get a policy analysis from a lot of different sources. You can maybe get one from the CBO or the GAO. So have we applied too much political partisanship to our policy analysis? And does that actually hinder our ability to do scientific policy analysis and professional policy analysis? So does the political policy analysis, which by the way is not factual, it probably is factual. It certainly emphasizes, the political analysis emphasizes different kinds of factors and conclusions. But do those kinds of analyses hinder the pursuit of scientific analysis and professional analysis? You know, a great example, it's not really policy analysis, but a great example of professional analysis being ruined really is the story of Enron. And we know that Enron really was dishonest in their books, but they were aided and abetted by one of the most famous and notable CPA firms, Arthur Andersen, which went out of business because of Enron and was ruined professionally. But that's kind of perhaps a tangential example, but an example nevertheless of how you can ruin so-called unbiased research by smuggling in your own bias. And then there's this issue of evidence-based policymaking. I have you read some stuff from Professor Paul Kearney's website. I really like Professor Kearney's website, I have to admit. I think he's really accessible. I think he's down to earth. And if you explore his website, you'll see a lot about policy. I really like his 1,000-word essays. He explains different approaches to the policy process in 1,000 words or less. And I think it's super, really. So I really highly recommend using his website. But he's written a book on this idea of evidence-based policymaking, and he's not critical of evidence-based policymaking. What he is doing really, though, is he's cautioning scientists really to understand that the policy process, policymakers themselves, are not always going to necessarily listen to your scientific evidence. Should they? Yes. A member of Congress or a senator bringing a snowball into a hearing in Congress to prove that climate change doesn't exist is ludicrous, I think. You know, I can go outside right now. I'm looking at snow. I can go out and make a lot of snowballs. That doesn't mean climate change doesn't exist. But um, the point is that policymakers are going to listen to evidence um, by using shortcuts. Rational, what Kearney talks about is rational shortcuts um, and irrational shortcuts, where they draw on emotions, gut feelings, deeply held beliefs, and habits. And I would also recommend there's this book by Baumgartner and Jones called The Politics of Information. And Baumgartner and Jones talk about the heuristics or the rules that policymakers use to help them make decisions. Um, and so the reality is, and this is what Paul Kearney is getting at, the reality is that yes, there is evidence, but there are also other factors to consider. He's not painting a picture of a hopeless case. What he's saying is that you have to be cognizant that policymakers use maybe different rules than you use. So I want to contrast that with what Bardak talks about, with this Eightfold Path. Okay, so I really like the Eightfold Path because it really is a way of thinking. So the project is not really, the term project is not really organized around the Eightfold Path per se, but I think if you use the Eightfold Path, it's really going to help you think through your policy analysis. So first, again, they talk about defining the problem. So I don't want to be completely redundant. They have different steps, um, but again, define the problem, right? So we have to understand that uncertainty exists, right? Um, and we have to be able to somehow quantify the problem. It doesn't mean that you have to use exotic statistics. It might just be simple descriptive statistics or comparisons, but you should be able to do that somehow. Second, they say assemble evidence. Start assembling evidence. Here again, here's what I kind of like about the Bardak book and the approach that it's written from. They use the approach that you're a policy analyst and you don't have all the time in the world to assemble evidence. So there's various sources of evidence out there that you can use, and you should understand what those are, right? There are government websites, the census, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Bureau of Economic Analysis. There's good sources of evidence out there which help you uh, because you don't have to recreate all the data, right? There's literature available, and it's not always academic literature, but popular media and think tanks. The third step is construct alternatives. So what Bardak talks about is starting comprehensive, starting big, and then going narrow, right? The biggest trap we fall into doing policy analysis is thinking, we're going to solve everything. So again, I don't mean to be redundant, but harken back to Social Security. No single policy analysis is going to fix Social Security. You're better off thinking about Social Security and then looking at policy alternatives for something that you want to narrowly work on, which might be, for example, the payroll tax. Is the payroll tax adequate? Just attack that problem. So construct your alternatives, and what Bardak says you should do is kind of, again, this is where you use a little bit of brainstorming, right? And ask yourself these questions, and then think about it. Then that helps you narrow down. So the fourth step is select the criteria of evaluation. And here again, this is really important, I think, to make the point here. Look at the book and see what they're talking about here, what Bardak's talking about. Look at all those 1, 2, 3, 7 different kinds of criteria of evaluation. They are not all what we would call rational, right? Is political acceptability rational? Are freedom and community rational? I would argue that most people would say they're not, but that doesn't make them invalid. you have to decide based on the problem that you're attacking what kind of criteria you want to use to evaluate, right? And then you want to have some kind of understandable metrics that support that. So you want to be able to have a way to measure freedom and community. You want to be able to have a way to measure policy sustainability. You want to be able to have a way to measure administrative feasibility. So there's two parts, right? There's the criterion and there's the tool that measures it. And then you want to project the outcomes. So that's really just thinking about, hey, what happens if we keep doing this? That's really one of the basic things that the Congressional Budget Office does. If you read about what they do, is they project laws and bills out to 10 years. They analyze the 10-year budget impact, provided that no other laws will change. That's their basis of looking at new law or changed law. So you want to project out. You have a base case, such as the current rate of taxation, and then you project it out. How's it going to affect the deficit? And so we know that a lot has been written about the Tax Reform Act of late 2017. What's the impact on the deficit? Much of that comes from the Congressional Budget Office. Okay, so here's the last ones. Confront the trade-offs, stop, focus, narrow, deepen, decide, and tell your story. So confront the trade-offs, right? So each of your alternatives might be a good alternative. That's the biggest thing. Sometimes I think when we talk about decision-making models, we have this idea that I have 3 alternatives or 4 alternatives, and one is clearly better. You know from working in organizations that doesn't happen. You know that sometimes there might be 2 or 3 alternatives that are really probably good to choose. So how do you choose them? I mean, what are you gaining and losing by choosing one and not choosing the other? This is where you kind of think in terms of opportunity cost. What am I giving up to choose this alternative? And when I can state that, then I can say I would still choose this alternative in spite of knowing what I'm giving up here. And then he says what you really ought to do is kind of take a deep breath and say, okay, if this is really the best idea on earth, how come nobody's ever tried this before? That's a valid question. And it's one that merits an answer. And then finally, tell your story. So really, this is what your policy analysis is. Telling your story about this policy. And would regular people understand what you're saying? You know, maybe they wouldn't understand the tools you use, but they ought to understand your logic. And that's really important. So let me kind of move this into the course project and how we want to put it together. I think I have just a couple slides left here. So your mission on this policy analysis project is really to combine the thinking from these 2 texts, from Kraft and from Bardak, into 2 deliverables that I'm asking you to provide for this project. The first is your policy brief. So this, not including reference pages and any kind of appendices or title page, this is going to be about 10 to 15 pages in length. And again, the reason I do that is because this is a simulation. You are simulating being a policy analyst for a lawmaker or a person in the executive branch of government. Actually, some of you have done that. So you know that those people are busy. They would really love to read your 60-page paper, but they don't have time. So the policy brief is going to provide them what they need to know. So I do want references cited in the text, actually. So all I'm asking for, if you see that Smith 2016 there, is in-text citations. I'm really not hung up on using the APA bibliography. I just really want a readable text with in-text citations. The second deliverable really is what I call this roadshow presentation. So again, the person you're working for has to defend this policy change or this new policy. And so how would they do that? Well, typically how they do that is they have their talking points, right? So we're all familiar with talking points. But they might also have a PowerPoint or other kind of media presentation that they can present at a moment's notice. So this is a 12 to 20 minute in length presentation, which explains the analysis to curious audiences. So that's really the approach that I'm using for this project. It is a simulation. And so here in this slide, I talk about the chapters. You see there's 8 chapters, or it doesn't mean that it follows Bardak's Eightfold Path. They're just, it happens to be the same number. So first thing I want you to do is write me an exploratory memo, and that's due January 26th, coming up, in which you discuss your ideas with me. So that's part 1 of the project. So there's an assignment hanging out there on Canvas that explains this part of the project. The second part of your project is the executive summary. This is going to be a real brief executive summary, and even though it comes first in this list, this is actually something you would write last. So the third thing is the background and policy problem statement. So this is going to be part 2 of the project. There's an assignment out there where you will give me the background and policy problem statement. My goal is to comment on that and get it back to you. And then you will use that to do part 3, which is construct your policy alternatives and selection criteria. Then I will comment on that and get it back to you. And then part 4 combines the projected outcomes comparison, the recommended policy solution, and all your references and appendices. In other words, the completed project. So you can see this is in 4 parts. So you're going to give me your exploratory memo, and then you're going to have another assignment that is your policy problem statement, a third assignment that has your policy alternatives with your selection criteria, and the fourth assignment wraps everything up. So really we're building this policy brief as we go along. You can see how that works. And then part 5 is the presentation which you are going to create, and that is going to be presented, I would say in class. This is an online class. It's going to be presented on the discussion board during one of the second to last week of the class. And so during that week, your opportunity will be to view your classmates' policy analysis projects and comment on them. So that's really the major effort for this class this term. There's a couple references. I'm looking forward to your discussion on the policy analysis process this week. Thank you.